So let's see. I'm getting better at this. All right. So here, today we're talking about the upside down kingdom of God. We've covered so far, quite a bit of territory. I think one of the things worth looking at is we've got this narrative stuff going on. Jesus is baptized. He calls his disciples. He's healing and doing a bunch of things. And he's encountering different people, Pharisees, John's disciples and whatnot. And at the same time, Matthew's got these, Sermon on the Mount, the sending of the disciples, and, what kind of response you can expect, how the kingdom grows and in different ways. And then today, a lot of what gets covered is about how the new community is supposed to treat each other. And that's not all there is, of course. There's the whole gospel story, and there's the general story of Jesus. And each individual little story that gets covered on Sundays is valuable too. But sometimes it's illuminating to see some of these other ways that messages that were intentionally put together that aren't always obvious when you're just looking at individual passages at a time. This week we cover. I think you've covered these. Who's the greatest, and woe to whoever leads any one of these little ones to sin. God rejoices over the lost sheep. If your brother sins against you, this is what you do. Parable of the unforgiving servant. There's a dialogue about divorce, and then the disciples chasing the little children away. Then we get to the story of the rich young man, the laborers in the vineyard. That's the one where everybody gets paid the same, and it seems really unfair. Then Jesus talks about his death. And right after that, James and John's mom comes and says, make my sons your right and left hand. And then this one too ends with two blind men. Now, something I colored in yellow, the ones that aren't included in the lectionary. And there's a number of reasons why those don't get covered, mainly because the same theme gets covered someplace else. So where you take a story individually, there's multiple passages that you can use to cover the same concept. So those are the choices that were made. But when you're thinking of Matthew as having a bunch of themes, then having these stories together makes a huge difference. Another thing that's happening is last time there was some geographic tension. Jesus had to keep escaping outside of where the Pharisees and some of the temple authorities could reach him. This week, in these three, we see Jesus now taking the turn to Jerusalem. So we'll see him first going to the east side of the Jordan. He's avoiding Samaria. And then at the very end, he'll be coming up to Jericho, and that's where he meets the two blind men. So we see the story now. There was the heightening tension, and now we see him moving towards Judea. So that's another subplot that's going on here. And, chapter 14 through 20, you've got different expectations of people, who's the Messiah, who is Jesus, and what does that mean going on right before we get to what does the new community need to behave like in chapters 18 through 20. So that's the background. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, by extension, it's true of today also. The way faith in Jesus is uh, embraced. Very, very different. You have down expectations about the Messiah. Now I feel it's interpretations of the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And each group, just as then, thinks they're right and the other is wrong.
That's a good point. That comes out in spades.
Another one, maybe building on that, maybe just a little branch off of that tree a little bit. We talked a little bit last week about our individual relationship with God or with Christ, this one-on-one relationship. But he's not stressing that. Jesus isn't talking about your relationship with me or your relationship with God. That's almost a given, and he's always more talking about your relationship with others. Like you said, the how to live in God's creation and serve his people. And if we think about that being upside down, like you're talking about here today, it's certainly different than what we seem to be stressing today.
Today, meaning
that one-on-one, if I've got Jesus in my heart and I believe in him, that's all that I need.
Yeah, the other thought I had that I was sort of thinking about going through this was that in some of them it's really clear that the sort of fundamental problem people have when they're coming in and asking Jesus about something is they're trying to figure out a way to get themselves ahead. And it's not just enough that they want something good for themselves. They want to be better than somebody else, whether it's even asking the question, who's the greatest, or the more kind of explicit version where James and John's mother comes and she wants her sons to be at the, at the side of Jesus. And so I was kind of playing with the idea of, through all of these different sections, is there a sense in which Jesus is saying something about the problem with making yourself better than other people or failing to recognize the dignity of other people? And I got some mileage out of it. I don't know whether it holds up in every case, but certainly there was an element of that in a lot of the different sections.
I think that's a great observation, because that was going to be my next section, my next question. One of the themes is, who is the greatest, and how might that story tie together with some of these, with the different ones. And yeah, it doesn't fit all of them, but I'd like to explore that a little bit. What about the parable of the lost sheep? What about forgiving sins? How does that tie to who is the greatest in the kingdom? And
well, Muhammad Ali had the answer, I think. The well, it wasn't really a parable, but the idea of Christianity bringing the sword, that it's divisive also. And I think that holds true, very true today, even within the faith community itself. It's very sword-like and divisive, such as who is better, James and John? They should be elevated. I that I see a lot, wholesale.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how do we respond today? Is it the same answer as back then?
Well, pretty much, I think most of our prayers are, "Dear Lord, give us something to better our predicament or better our standing in some way." You know, like what you were saying there, Keith, for a moment. Um, and it's almost an afterthought at the end when it says, "Oh, but not my will, yours." But we want my will to be yours, God. Rather than aligning my will to God's, it's more about God aligning yours to mine. And I think that when we look at the different denominations who, just within Christianity itself, where one says, well, we have the answer and all the rest of you are wrong, it plays right into that narrative too.
Although from when I was a child, I feel it has improved tremendously um, on acceptance that there might be other paths besides, well, I was brought up Missouri Synod Lutheran, besides Missouri Synod Lutheran, that there are other paths. And God's love is wide.
That's a good point. So let's keep going on this. I'm going to add another layer. One of the things that showed up in this whole section too was difficult. Difficult keeps coming back up in many ways. You know, if something causes you to sin, you know, cut your hand off, you know, pull your eye out. I mean, those are drastic measures. But you know, I think it's describing something that's hard. The next thing that the disciples talk about being hard is, you know, marriage is hard. They say that's, you know, if you can't divorce somebody, better not to get married, which sounds really dumb. But there's that. There's
Jesus basically responds, "Oh, then you might consider making yourself a eunuch for me."
now that's
yeah. Cutting off something that's offensive, isn't it?
But there's something there that's that I hadn't quite thought about before, that all of the commentators brought out, and that is, if you're talking about Judaism in general, especially first century Judaism, if you aren't getting married and having children, you're not doing your duty to be fruitful and multiply. So being single for life, being you know, dedicated to some cause and therefore not marrying, was something that was just plain wrong theologically. And Jesus at this point says it's okay to be that way. It's okay to be single. So
Do you think to put a real branch out, do you think that is because he was describing himself, or do you think that is because he was married at the time? I know there's no proof either way, but
yeah, there's no hint of him being married at all that we can find anywhere. But
as a good Jew, he would have been, especially by the 30s.
yeah,
I kind of took him in that passage to be sort of talking about himself, you know, that he's actually pursuing something even greater than marriage, which, coming from him and in that context of how important marriage and family was, that if he's saying he's pursuing something even more important than that, and other people can too, then that just even magnifies how serious he's taking a life dedicated to God that doesn't involve marriage or just having kids.
And certainly we see Paul picking up on that theme when he talks about, you know, who makes a good religious leader, and, you know, encouraging them to be unmarried. That's the whole reasoning, I suppose, for the Roman Catholic Church to have unmarried priests. That you are serving something greater than you, that's greater than your theology, and that's God himself.
It's interesting too, though, the context where that comes up, where they've basically got such an impoverished view of marriage, and then Jesus is talking about service to God that often gets sort of explained in marital terms, and he's pointing them in that direction, but it almost feels like maybe there's a destiny that even that is going to get impoverished too. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but
he when he talks about heaven, and this woman's been married multiple times, who's her husband, there is no marriage in heaven, is what he says there. So you might, maybe an earthly marriage is impoverished.
Well, I don't mean that marriage is. I just mean that the disciples clearly have an impoverished idea of it, because they're saying, well, if you can't just leave your wife because a prettier girl walks down the street, then why would you get married at all? It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It just brought up a thought in my mind. Were the apostles married?
Peter most certainly was. Based on, I think it was, I want to say Clement, but for sure Eusebius. Paul was married, but he didn't travel with his wife. We know Peter was married for sure because Jesus heals his mother-in-law. But evidently she was still alive too. And Philip has daughters who then get married and so on. So we know he had a wife and so on and so forth. So I think it doesn't seem like Mary Magdalene was married.
Well, there was one again that I read that was an off source that they think that she was married to one of the Sanhedrin, and that's why she had money to help support, this whole apostles movement. But that's just, I don't know if it's speculation or if it's based upon tradition, or where that comes from exactly.
Yeah,
but certainly the Gospel according to Biff had her married to Herod.
Yeah. The other place where difficult comes up, the rich young man, it's easier for the camel type of thing, and then the disciples says, well, then who can? And then James and John's mother's request, Jesus is answering with, can you bear the cup that I bear? Just one after another there.
You'd think by reading, I'm sorry, I have a sick perspective. You'd think by reading these verses that looking at a Christian, they'd be one-eyed, one arm, and poor. They're a Christian. Look, he has one eye, one arm, and he's poor.
Well, let's go back to what does it mean to be childlike? Let's go back to that, because I think that's where some of the answers come from. What is, I've got some stuff I pulled up, but I'll let you guys comment. What is your thoughts on what does it mean to be childlike?
See, I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Because I guess you can look at it two ways. Children are extremely curious. I think if a child is not put down, they have amazing curiosity about what's about them. However, in growing up, I've always heard the interpretation of that as a child doesn't question, a child just listens to whatever a parent has to say and thus believes. So I have a problem with that verse because I obviously question.
So I was thinking about this. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and trying to think about what are the qualities that they have that maybe I can point at and say that seems to be maybe what Jesus is getting at. And there are times when, if they're having a difficult day and they're getting timeouts and they're screaming and everything, it's like, are they just gonna hate me? But then sure enough, if I have to go down to work and I come back up at the end of the day, they will literally just come running to me and just want to have a big hug, and they want to go have fun, and they'll still listen to me. They expect to come to me for things. Hey, sweetie. Sure enough,
Does you speak?
I've trained her well to be there as a prop if I need it for a question. But she knows to come to me to get something, and she trusts that when she does, she's gonna get it. And I think those are all things that if we could act that way towards God, like that, the trust, and sometimes even despite discipline that we have to go through, to still kind of get so excited and run after him as soon as we recognize his presence in our life. Like those seem like things that kids do a lot of the time that would be great to exhibit as followers of Jesus.
Good point. Good.
Yeah.
I know too that in other Bible studies I've had, there's been a distinction between being childish and childlike. And childlike for me is non-judgmental, trusting, loving, always coming back to the Father, like you were saying, Keith, and knowing that there's love there and never questioning that his love for you is going to be there. And, thinking even of dysfunctional families, no matter how bad the parent, those kids want them, they want the parent that they know and they love. And I think that's especially even though when it's hurtful.
David, what do you think?
I think that's part of the intent here. I think the other thing that came up in one of the commentaries that I've seen in other places too is, I think it's through probably elementary school. You really don't care what your friends' backgrounds are. You tend to play with anybody. And then as you get older, you sort of get social distinctions coming in. Slavery is a big thing these days. That's where you run into, you played with the slaves, and stuff. And at some point you learned the distinction. So childlike is probably before that distinction comes in.
But right, a couple verses before, we heard about suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not. I am thinking of the present day view of children. Back then, children were thought of very differently from, just that Bible verse, if nothing else.
Yeah, don't get a test, they're going to die anyway, right? I'm sorry, that's pretty callous, but no, I think you're right. They treated them differently for sure. Even my dad's generation, they were told to just be quiet because the adults are doing their thing,
Well, I think it's interesting. A couple things that are interesting. One, we talk about every man, woman, and child, so that a child is somehow something different on the spectrum. that they haven't been defined male or female almost at that point. And then secondly, how our world today expects kids to grow up quicker in some ways. And that, that they need to be discerning and distinctive and judgmental and all these things, primarily for safety's sake. But back then, when there wasn't as much of, I'm going to call it a threat to a child's safety, they had, in some ways, the opportunity to still be children until you looked at, probably by the time they were 3 years old, they were working. They were already taking care of younger children, or they had chores that were essential to the family's existence. So there's a lot, again, of dichotomies. So when he's talking about childlike, is it our version of what a child should be like, or his version of what a child should be like? And even with, David's callous remark, how many kids made it past 3 years old or 4 years old? There was a good percentage that did not.
Yeah, 25% didn't, based on
Wow.
statistics from Graves. And then 50% were dead by the time they were 18.
Wow.
The kind of other part of this that I was thinking about, again, with the theme of, thinking of yourself as better than someone, kids are one of those areas where it's really easy to just think, oh, they're just kids. I'm clearly better than them. I'm an adult now. I have this new dignity that they won't have for a long time. So I've got the right to think of myself as an authority over them. And I was talking with Shannon about this because it's terrible to say, but if I'm being honest, there are moments where if I'm getting frustrated with the kids and I discipline them and I do it out of anger and I feel guilty, I can make myself feel okay about it because, well, they need to learn. And when I do that, I think there's like an implicit, oh, I'm an authority, so I can do whatever I want. Like whatever my actions are, they're totally justified. And I think that's probably another thing that we don't just do to kids. We probably do it to people all the time. And the thing that's probably at the root of it is, I'm better than you, so it's okay that I do this.
Well, and I think that's also a theme in there too, in that because somehow I'm better, my reward's going to be greater. Right? Like the laborers in the vineyard is like, well, we worked longer, so surely we're going to get a bonus. And the bonus is going to be based upon how long I've been a Christian.
And the mother's request.
Right. Yeah.
That's definitely one of, that particular parable strikes somewhere deep in me in a way that really makes me have to think about myself, because it's hard to not, it's hard to get out of that mindset of, if they're even getting something good, then if I'm working really hard and doing a better job, then how much better is it going to get for me? Would I be able to not be disappointed in the fact that everybody gets the same? I don't know. I think probably not. I don't think I'm good enough.
Well,
The only thing I'll add to that parable that's really, really important understanding is that the amount of pay that the guy is giving is what it takes to feed a small family for a day. So if the laborers coming later got any less than what was promised, they wouldn't have enough to feed their family. That is one of the key things that you do have to know when you're going into that. That still doesn't make it easy, though.
It still doesn't make it easy. No. And I think that, I think I lost my thought. You should let me talk, because now that one's gone, and it was a good one.
Well,
David.
Oh, I know what it was. It was, I think that when we talk about people, who's going to be saved, who's going to heaven, we're judging clearly. One of the things is, well, they're really good people. So we're already saying really good people are going to be rewarded. regardless of their faith. So we're perpetuating that. And I think in some ways, Jesus wants to knock that thought down to us, a little bit. It says later on when we talk about everybody with multiple gifts and the body, is differentiated in terms of the jobs that it can perform. Your hands can't perform the same job as your ears and so on. He really wants us not to focus on just being good or being better. He wants us to be a servant. And by definition, a servant is somehow less than the master.
Let me throw out another angle on this set of passages that'll probably build on that. How does Jesus want this new community to be? And here, if you start with who's the greatest, and then he talks about temptation, and he talks about lost sheep and the joy of finding them, which leads into how many times do I have to forgive? And he says many, many, and then he gives the parable of the unforgiving servant. And then you got the divorce thing and the children come, and then you get to the rich man, which also ties into that, and the laborers in the vineyard, which ties into that. When you take those together and see it as a description of a community, what characteristics would Jesus be talking about?
I mean, definitely, I think respect for people as people, and because you're treating them as sort of equal human beings, you don't see their, current, whether it's lack of faith or something that they're doing wrong, as something that disqualifies them from the community, but a reason to go help and serve them.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. One of the commentators talked about how you get to bind and loose, as in who gets to be in the community and not. And when you look at how many times do I forgive, and he gets into if you once you take it to the community and they say, yeah, he's no good, he's gone, that means that the church gets to decide who stays and who gets to be excommunicated. But when you take this as a whole, I think overwhelmingly it's no, that's not what we're trying to get at all. The whole idea is we want reconciliation. We want a generosity of forgiveness, a generosity of building community. And this loosing and binding and stuff like that Jesus talked about before is about God's generosity coming into the community and how that incorporates, and just the total of the opposite of being split denominationally in a bad way and so on.
And it's interesting too, he's not talking about vengeance or even justice, in any of these passages, because certainly our sense of justice with the laborers in the vineyards would say it wasn't administered fairly. But again, I think God wants us to know that he's in charge, we're not.
The part about how many times should I forgive, I was watching some stuff about that passage, and there was an interesting connection that I'd never heard before, that when Jesus is asked, should I forgive 7 times? And they're thinking, 7 is a lot, that I'm going to sound really great saying that I'm even willing to forgive 7 times. And Jesus responds 77. Apparently, back in Genesis, one of Cain's sons has this poem where he's been wronged by someone he refers to as a younger man. He says he got cut by a younger man, and he has a poem that he's saying to his wives that, if Cain avenged himself 7 times, then I avenged myself 77 times. So there's this parallel that's interesting there, because if Cain is supposed to be the the sort of like paradigm for vengeance, then he's saying, look how many times more vengeful I am than even that. And if you think about what that means for Jesus's response, he's saying, if you think that 7 times is the paradigm for forgiveness, then I'm telling you to be in reference to your concept, what that guy thought Cain was to vengeance. That's how forgiving I want you to be, in your heart. Um, so
That's got
that,
to be Tim Mackey. That Lakish or whatever that guy is. That's one of
yeah,
his favorite things. Yeah.
it's really cool. And then the fact that that leads immediately into, and by the way, here's what happens when you don't forgive, because remember, you're the forgiving one. So don't try to make yourself better by talking about how you're going to forgive someone a few times. Remember that you've been forgiven, and that's how you need to go get sent out into the world.
Well, I'm in trouble because I know that God's had to have forgiven me at least 77 times for things
Yeah.
I've done.
Yeah.
Oh. Or thinking
Can
of,
I put a Lego block going to the side here, going back to building on what you were talking about before about the laborers in the field and the rich young man, and bringing it forward to today. Um, it brings up in my mind that that is a rather socialistic type of viewing, that people are being treated equally and that the rich young man is supposed to be give his riches away and be equal with others who do not have. And we view ourselves, right or wrong, as a Christian nation. And yet there is an unbelievable fear of socialism and communism, which tends to embrace more the laborers in the field, everybody getting equal, not rich, not poor type thing.
that's, that's an interesting one, and I've read and thought, and I don't claim to have the answers, but I've got a couple of things to bring up that I think will be interesting for that. Because the first question is, what is the problem with a rich man?
Oh,
What is his?
It's not the riches. It's the fact that he is holding on and values them so much, and that he values it over everything else.
yeah, I tend to agree with you, Cindy, about what you value, the 10 top things you value in life. I took a course when the first war overseas, and the instructor had taught at the Marines, and she said in a Muslim country, if you go, they'd say, what is the most important 10 most important things of your life? And number 1 would be Allah, by far. In this country, same survey, God, if made the list at all, it was down like 10. If God was made at all. Now, I don't know why I brought that up.
No, it's a good point, because the reverse of that, I think, would be where the Buddhists start out. What causes suffering? It's attachment. That's their answer to it. And I have issues with the ultimate concern of the Buddhist concept, but I think where they do get it right is the analysis of where does suffering come from. And lack of stuff is one thing, but overly attached to something certainly does cause pain. And I think that's where the put your treasures in heaven thing comes up.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that with the rich man, one of the things that I was, just because with all this stuff, it's so familiar, I've been trying to see it in a little bit of a different light. But I wonder if the real problem with the rich man is what happens before Jesus asks him to get rid of his riches, which um, he, he's asking Jesus, what do I need to do? And Jesus says, well, follow these commandments. And maybe his real problem is that his immediate reaction is like, yeah, no problem. I've got all that done.
Mhm.
So that Jesus is going, okay, you don't understand what I'm asking of you at all. So he gets straight to the heart of the problem. It's like, well, all right, then go sell all your stuff. Because if you're really keeping all my commandments, then, you know, you wouldn't have the concern for it. And so there's a way of looking at it, and maybe this is wrong, but there's a way of looking at it that maybe Jesus doesn't really want him to go sell all of his stuff per se. He wants him to acknowledge that, you know, even trying to understand and follow the commandments is just so basic that we need to be coming assuming that we're not doing nearly enough. And we have to understand that deep in our heart, we're not even close to being there, and that we need him.
And that's why I love Matthew. And I think that's where if that is causing you to sin, or, by omission or commission, cut it off and get rid of it. Have that attitude is what he's saying in the early one. That's where these tie together. I don't think, like you said, it's not about the wealth. It's what it does to his psyche. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, justice and socialism. The thing. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. Speak.
Can I just do one addition on before we leave it on the rich man?
Yeah.
The rich man is rich because others are very poor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we are looking at currently, the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, and the growing divide, so that being rich is not the problem. It's that the others are not.
And that's kind of what I was where I was going to go. The one thing that's consistent about justice as it comes up is, how are the vulnerable in society treated? Are they cared for? It doesn't matter whether they're super rich people or not. The measure is, how are the poor, or how are the vulnerable taken care of?
And if you, again, if I'm trying to fit all of these stories into the, putting yourself above other people, you can think of it as, maybe part of the point of the rich man is that he thinks he deserves it, right? Like he wants to, and the converse, that other people that don't have what he has don't deserve it. So that, he wants to figure out how he can follow Jesus so that he can get something out of it too. So I've already got the riches. Now, if I can be great in the eyes of God, then I've got everything I want. And then it totally ignores the way that we're supposed to be serving other people.
Mm-hmm. I think that ties together real well with the first shall be last, the last shall be first, and the concepts that come in there. So, I don't know, Joan, I guess I kind of feel like, the disparity in rich and poor isn't a big issue, as long as those who are without can feel secure and can see their life getting better. I kind of see that as, for example, although the guy's not perfect, whether it's Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, I admire the guys for saying, okay, I'll never need this kind of wealth. I'm going to put it to use. And in the case of Bill and Melinda Gates, because they're excellent administrators and developers, they're using that talent to put to use that, wealth that's there. And that concept itself, I admire a lot.
I agree. I agree. And God gives everybody different gifts.
Yeah.
And it's the way they've used the gifts. And I have no issue with that.
Mhm.
But when especially now with COVID, a huge section of our population have lost jobs and are the lines in downtown St. Pete to get food
Mhm.
at the shelters. That begs the question that of rich young men. I don't have an answer, nor do our politicians, I fear, but it is a current issue, just as it was back then.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Um, you know, that's why when the first checks came out for stimulus, I have an income. I turned it around and gave it to, St. Pete Free Clinic because
Right,
they can use it. I didn't need it.
right.
So, but having said that, do I do everything? No, there's probably a lot more we could be doing.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, sure, sure.
Do we systematize it in government? I don't know.
That's why I say that I don't know the answer.
Yeah, but I think the measure is still there. How are the most vulnerable being treated in society? And if the answer there is not good enough, then we still got a job. I think that's the one thing that this makes perfectly clear.
That I agree.
Yeah.
In fact, after reading this, I have more questions than answers.
Good.
Well, I think that's one thing that I truly admire about Jesus is that he never says something that's so clear that you have a definitive answer, that all you have to do is go to the Talmud and it'll tell you exactly, the action you're supposed to take. He is forever challenging your basic motivators and your basic way of looking at the world and trying to make you see it through a new lens. Hey, rich young man, you think you're doing great, but let me tell you, here's the next step. And every time I feel like when we think we're doing something great, even James and John's mother, she was looking out for her boys. They had sacrificed so much to follow Jesus. You know, she thought it was time for them to be rewarded. But even then, he's like, okay, I get where you're coming from, but this is what it really means. And I think each time we look at each of these parables or each of these lessons, he's always taking us, let's peel the banana one more time, or like I was talking
Yeah.
last week, the artichoke.
Yeah. Don't you love how he puts James and John's mom story right between his talking about his death, and then coming right after that is two blind men?
As if James and John are the blind men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Keith, you pointed it out for another passage. Here it is again, the two blind men, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting too that one of the patterns that I started to see is how often Matthew will kind of hammer a point over and over and over and then show people not getting it
Mm-hmm.
as sort of a response. Like with the two blind men, they're crying out. Jesus was passing by and they cry out, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. And the crowd's response is the crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent, but they cried out all the more, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, son of David. So there's teaching after teaching of saying, don't look down on other people, take care of them, go serve them. And then these two blind men that all they want is to be healed, and they know that Jesus can do it, and people are saying, shut up. And Jesus has to go over and say, all right, I'll take care of it. And I was kind of curious because, you think about you think about the disciples as ultimately being so, or I guess I had this image of them as being exemplars in so many ways, Judas notwithstanding. And I was going, I'm trying to remember, at what point does this turn around? When does this turn around? Do they have a moment? Is it when Jesus dies? Is it when he's resurrected? At what point do the disciples finally get it and kind of give up on their doubt and start to really serve the right way? And I know this is jumping way too far ahead, but I just thought it was interesting because it's been kind of coloring the way I've been reading a lot of this stuff. At the very, very end of Matthew, the last thing that's said about the disciples is, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. So he tells them to go to Galilee, go up to the mountain, and I'll meet you there. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. That's the last thing that's said about Jesus's followers. Because after that, it's just a quote from Jesus basically saying, go make disciples of all the nations. That's the last thing that Matthew says about the people that were told by Jesus that I'm going to die and get resurrected. They go and meet him and they worship him, and some doubt it.
But don't you think that's just the church today?
No, absolutely. I mean,
There's so many of us who still, worship him, but still have doubts.
That's me.
Oh, me too. And it's really interesting specifically for that reason. But it made that pattern clearer, that Matthew will say Jesus is trying to hammer you over the head with this message, and then ultimately we keep not getting it, and Jesus keeps coming back and keeps telling us and keeps, so it becomes clear that we're not, it's when we're looking at something like the parable of the lost sheep, we're not supposed to be thinking about, oh, there are going to be these other people that need God to go out and get them. Like, no, that's us.
Yeah.
We're the lost one. We're not the crowd of 99 that's hanging back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Good thought, Keith. Good thought.
Yeah.
I like that. As well as Cindy's constantly being challenged. I like that too.
I think it's really important that, Bible studies bring out doubt and questions and opposite views, and it to be okay, I think that's yeah.
I think one time this week it was kind of interesting to me. We talk about the Bible, particularly as Lutherans, as being the living word. I think that's actually, what one of our Bibles around here is called, the living word, which allows us to find an interpretation within today's culture. I'll put a question mark there because I'm not quite sure what word I mean there. It came up in the hearings of Amy Comey as to whether or not the Constitution should be viewed the same way, as the living law versus. So, and I thought, well, certainly as we look at the law and the gospel, we treat them as newly revealed information to us with the light of our current situation. And it's like, can we or should we apply the same yardstick to both? Does politics and government have the same requirements, responsibilities, etc., as our religion?
Interesting. Some people think yes, some people think no.
Right, and I would imagine that some of it is based upon your upbringing, and particularly your upbringing inside of
values,
church and value systems.
David, your question, your earlier question keeps coming back to me. What's wrong with the rich man? And I thought about the rich man's choices in everyday life.
Mhm.
And I thought of, and how can you escape it? Keith, in case you don't know it, I am liberal. They know it already.
Mhm.
Choices of some of my friends who vote for Trump because of the economic benefits they perceive coming from a Trump presidency, because it would benefit them economically.
Mhm.
And I question, you ask, what is wrong with the rich man? And your talk about values, Cindy, and government. It's how you make your value choices, at least in my opinion,
Mhm.
how you make your value choices and what your values depend on. And I think that might be part answer to what you asked about the rich man.
It is interesting, particularly, I've got friends on both sides of the spectrum, clearly,
Sure.
politically, and on Facebook, how they portray themselves and why they're one way or the other. And I told David, I said, for some people, it is not a question of the policies that the party represents. For them, it's strictly personality. For others, they're single issue people. And I'll include those economic guys as single issue people. But, my stepmother and a good part of my brothers are all about abortion. And they would not vote for anybody that they
Mhm.
thought, promoted that, because that's their issue. That's what they vote on. And it's very hard, because I think you do have to weigh both, personality, policies, politics, and your own value system. And if you're trying some kind of a sliding scale to figure out where you fit, mine's all over the place, as to how I make certain, I'll call them political judgments.
Well, guys, we're having a lot of fun, but I think we need to wrap it up. And man, it just goes to show you, the intimate group can have even better discussions.
Well, thank you for the intimate group. I appreciate it. Hi, Keith. Enjoy your week.
You too.
Yeah. We'll see you guys.
Keep